Picture this. July 22nd, 1209, the prosperous city of Béziers in southern France. Crusader armies have breached the walls. Citizens flee to churches, clutching their children, praying for sanctuary. Catholic and Cathar neighbors huddle together. They've lived side by side for generations, intermarried, done business together. The Crusaders demand the city surrender its roughly 200 Cathars for execution. The citizens refuse. We cannot tell our neighbors from strangers. Then comes the order that will echo through history. Arnaud Amalric, papal legate and abbot of Citeaux, allegedly declares, "Kill them all. God will know his own." What follows is one of medieval Europe's worst massacres. Between 15,000 and 20,000 men, women and children are slaughtered in churches, homes, streets. No one is spared. The Crusaders don't bother distinguishing Catholics from heretics. They kill everyone. The city burns for days. But here's the shocking thing. This wasn't warfare between different religions. This was Christians killing Christians, Catholics exterminating fellow believers whose only crime was interpreting scripture differently. The Cathars weren't foreign invaders or pagan barbarians. They were your neighbors, your merchants, your craftsmen. People who believed the material world was created by an evil God, and that spiritual purity required rejecting physical pleasures entirely. The story of how a peaceful religious movement became the target of history's first genocidal crusade begins not in southern France but 300 years earlier in the Byzantine Empire, where ancient ideas about good and evil were experiencing a remarkable revival. The theological roots of Catharism traced back to the 3rd century Persian prophet Mani, whose teachings blended Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Gnosticism into a comprehensive dualist worldview. Manichaeism taught that reality consisted of two eternal principles locked in cosmic struggle: light, representing good, spirit, and truth, opposed by darkness, embodying evil, matter, and deception. Though officially suppressed by both Roman and Byzantine authorities, these Manichaean concepts persisted in underground communities and influenced religious movements throughout the medieval period. The most significant step in this theological evolution occurred in 10th century Bulgaria under Byzantine rule, where a movement called Bogomilism emerged. Named after a priest called Bogomil, meaning beloved of God, this distinctly Slavic interpretation of dualist Christianity would prove instrumental in transmitting these beliefs westward to Europe. Bogomil teachings maintained that the material world was Satan's creation, that he had rebelled against God and trapped divine souls within physical bodies. According to Bogomil doctrine, Christ was purely spiritual. He appeared on earth to provide knowledge of salvation but never truly took physical form. The movement rejected the institutional church, sacraments performed with material elements, and the entire hierarchical structure of Byzantine Christianity. Bogomil communities developed sophisticated organizations with two tiers: ordinary believers called auditors and a spiritual elite called the perfect, who underwent a ritual called the consolamentum, a ceremony involving laying on of hands believed to confer the Holy Spirit. The perfect practiced strict asceticism: no meat, no dairy, no wine, no sex, dedicating themselves entirely to prayer, fasting, and teaching. This system allowed the movement to maintain both popular appeal and doctrinal rigor, and through trade routes connecting Constantinople with Italian ports like Venice and Genoa, these ideas were about to reach Western Europe, where they would flourish, transform, and ultimately trigger one of history's bloodiest religious conflicts. Transmission of dualist beliefs from Byzantine sphere to Western Europe occurred through multiple channels during the 11th century. Trade routes facilitated not just commercial exchange, but movement of ideas and individuals. Byzantine merchants, craftsmen, and scholars carried theological concepts westward, while Western pilgrims, crusaders and traders encountered Eastern Christian traditions during their travels. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204 would later accelerate this process, but significant transmission had already occurred through peaceful means. Missionary activity played crucial roles. Bogomil preachers, driven by persecution in Byzantine Empire, sought refuge and new converts in regions beyond imperial control. But these missionaries possessed theological sophistication and organizational experience, enabling them to establish lasting communities. They typically presented themselves as reformers seeking to restore authentic Christian practice rather than founders of entirely new religions, a strategy initially helping them avoid detection by ecclesiastical authorities. The earliest documented manifestations of what historians now recognize as Proto-Cathar beliefs appeared in northern Italy during mid-11th century, particularly in prosperous regions of Lombardy and Piedmont. The urban centers of Milan, Brescia, and Piacenza provided fertile ground for these new religious ideas. Their growing merchant classes and artisan communities possessed both literacy and independence necessary to engage with complex theological concepts. Unlike rural populations bound by traditional feudal relationships, urban dwellers enjoyed greater social mobility and were more receptive to alternative religious expressions. The Lombard cities' political situation also favored development of heretical movements. The ongoing conflict between papal and imperial authority, known as the investiture controversy, created confusion about legitimate religious leadership and weakened ecclesiastical control. Local bishops frequently found themselves caught between competing loyalties, leaving space for alternative religious teachers to operate. The fundamental theological principles defining Catharism represented radical departure from Orthodox Christian doctrine. Central to Cathar belief was absolute dualism, the conviction that two divine principles of equal power governed the universe. The good God ruled the spiritual realm of light, truth, and eternal souls. The evil God, or Satan, the demiurge, controlled the material world of darkness, deception, and temporal existence. This dualism extended to human nature itself. Cathars believed divine souls had become trapped within physical bodies through Satan's deception and could only achieve salvation by rejecting the material world entirely. Cathar cosmology described the fall of souls through complex mythological narrative. Satan had infiltrated heaven and convinced a portion of angels to rebel against God. These fallen souls were then imprisoned within material bodies and forced to undergo repeated reincarnations, what they called metempsychosis, until they achieved sufficient spiritual purification to return to their divine origin. This process of reincarnation continued indefinitely unless the soul received the consolamentum and lived according to perfect standards. The rejection of material world led Cathars to develop distinctive understanding of Christ and salvation. They maintained Christ was purely spiritual and had never truly taken physical form, appearing to humans only as divine vision or phantom. The crucifixion was either illusory or symbolic, rather than historical event involving physical suffering. Salvation came not through Christ's sacrifice, but through the knowledge, the gnosis, he provided about reality's true nature and the path to spiritual liberation. Cathar sacramental theology reflected their dualist worldview by rejecting all ceremonies involving material elements. They denied efficacy of baptism with water, communion with bread and wine, and marriage between physical bodies. The only valid sacrament was the consolamentum, administered through laying on of hands by one who had already received it. This ceremony was believed to confer the Holy Spirit directly and enable the recipient to achieve spiritual purity necessary for salvation. The consolamentum typically occurred either when someone decided to join ranks of the perfect or as deathbed ritual for ordinary believers. The ethical implications of Cathar dualism produced distinctive moral code setting believers apart from Orthodox neighbors. The perfect practiced complete vegetarianism, avoiding not only meat but also eggs, milk, and cheese, products resulting from animal reproduction which they viewed as Satan's method of perpetuating the material world. They abstained from sexual relations and marriage. Considering procreation a form of collaboration with evil, oaths were forbidden because they invoked God's name in connection with worldly affairs, and violence was rejected absolutely, even in self-defense. These rigorous standards applied only to the perfect. Ordinary believers, known as credentes, were permitted to live conventional lives while accepting Cathar theology and receiving spiritual guidance from the perfect. This practical arrangement enabled the movement to attract followers who admired its spiritual ideals without requiring immediate lifestyle changes that would have made recruitment nearly impossible. Credentes typically received the consolamentum only when approaching death, allowing them to achieve salvation while maintaining their social and economic responsibilities during life. The intellectual sophistication of early Cathar theology attracted educated clergy and laypeople who found Orthodox Christianity intellectually unsatisfying or morally compromised. Cathar teachers possessed extensive knowledge of Scripture and could engage in complex theological debates with Catholic opponents. They developed sophisticated arguments explaining apparent contradictions in biblical texts and offered coherent explanations for evil's existence that avoided theological difficulties faced by Orthodox Christianity. By end of 11th century, Cathar communities had established themselves firmly in northern Italy and begun expanding into southern France, where they would eventually achieve their greatest success. The movement's organizational flexibility, theological sophistication, and moral authority positioned it to challenge Catholic orthodoxy throughout Western Europe during following centuries. The sophisticated two-tiered system, allowing perfect to maintain doctrinal purity while credentes participated in normal economic life, proved remarkably effective. The perfect often worked as artisans, particularly in textile trades, which allowed them to travel between cities while maintaining their ascetic lifestyle and spreading their teachings. Their workshops became unofficial centers of Cathar religious life, where credentes gathered for instruction and perfect coordinated activities with colleagues in other cities. The concentration of Cathar economic activity in specific districts created informal religious neighborhoods, where the movement's influence became particularly pronounced. But the peaceful expansion of this dualist movement was about to face its first major challenge from Catholic authorities, who were finally beginning to recognize the theological threat it posed. The expansion of Cathar influence during 12th century reached its peak in Languedoc, the prosperous region of southern France that would become the heartland of Western dualism. The county of Toulouse emerged as primary center of Cathar activity, where the movement's theological sophistication and organizational capabilities found fertile ground among the region's cosmopolitan urban populations and independent-minded nobility. The city of Toulouse itself became home to numerous Cathar communities, with perfect establishing workshops, teaching centers, and informal religious meeting places throughout its commercial districts. Toulouse's strategic position along major trade routes connecting Mediterranean with northern Europe provided ideal conditions for Cathar expansion. Merchants traveling between Italian ports and French commercial centers carried not only goods but also religious ideas, enabling perfect to establish contacts with potential converts and maintain communication with distant communities. Carcassonne developed into another major Cathar center, its strategic location controlling access between Mediterranean coastal regions and interior valleys of Languedoc. The city's merchants and artisans proved especially receptive to Cathar teachings, with several prominent families converting entirely to the movement and using their resources to support perfect and protect them from persecution. The fortified nature of Carcassonne provided additional security for Cathar activities, as the movement's supporters could control access to the city and monitor movements of potential threats. Béziers emerged as third major Cathar stronghold, its location near Mediterranean coast, facilitating connections with Italian Cathar communities and enabling the movement to benefit from maritime trade networks. The city's substantial population of merchants and craftsmen provided ready audience for Cathar preaching, while its distance from major episcopal centers reduced immediate threat of Catholic persecution. The relationship between Cathar communities and local nobility represented one of the movement's most crucial strategic advantages. Raymond VI of Toulouse emerged as most significant noble protector of Catharism, using his extensive territorial holdings and political influence to shield Perfect and Credentes from persecution, while benefiting from their economic activities and social stability. Raymond VI's support for Catharism reflected both personal conviction and political calculation. The Count himself appears to have embraced Cathar theological teachings, surrounding himself with perfect advisors and reportedly receiving the consolamentum on his deathbed. His protection of Cathar communities also served his political interests by strengthening his position against Catholic authorities who sought to extend their influence over his territories, and by maintaining loyalty of subjects who had converted to the movement. The practical benefits Raymond VI derived from Cathar presence included enhanced economic prosperity through their commercial activities, improved social stability through their emphasis on honest dealing and non-violence, and increased political independence through their rejection of Catholic ecclesiastical authority. The Count's court became centre of Cathar intellectual activity where Perfect engaged in theological discussions with visiting scholars. Other southern French lords followed Raymond VI's example in providing protection for Cathar communities, creating a network of noble support extending throughout Languedoc. The Viscounts of Béziers and Carcassonne, the Counts of Foix, and numerous lesser nobles integrated Cathar Perfect into their households and defended Cathar religious practices against Catholic interference. This noble protection enabled Cathar communities to operate with unprecedented openness. The cultural flowering marking Cathar expansion throughout Languedoc during mid-12th century created one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated civilizations. The influence of Cathar thought on troubadour poetry and courtly literature produced enduring legacies. The sophisticated theological concepts of Catharism, particularly their emphasis on spiritual love transcending material attachments, resonated strongly with emerging traditions of courtly romance and provided intellectual foundations for new forms of literary expression. Troubadour poets operating within cultural milieu of southern France encountered Cathar ideas through interactions with noble patrons who supported the movement and through direct contact with Perfect, who participated in court intellectual life. The dualist emphasis on superiority of spiritual over physical love provided conceptual frameworks for idealized romantic relationships, becoming central themes in troubadour poetry. The notion that true love involved purification of base material desires and elevation of soul toward divine truth aligned closely with Cathar theological principles. The integration of Cathar beliefs into cultural and intellectual life of medieval Occitania produced unique civilization combining sophisticated theology, advanced commercial practices, and innovative literary expression. Its cultural flowering attracted attention from throughout Europe and contributed to the region's reputation as center of learning and refinement, rivaling the greatest courts and universities of medieval world. But this prosperity and cultural sophistication inevitably attracted attention of Catholic ecclesiastical authorities, who recognized growing threat that dualist theology posed to Orthodox Christian doctrine and papal authority. The Church's initial responses to Catharism reflected both theological concern and practical recognition that traditional methods of combating heresy had proven inadequate against movement combining sophisticated theology, strong popular support, and protection from secular authorities. Bernard of Clairvaux emerged as Catholic Church's most formidable early opponent of Catharism, bringing his considerable theological expertise and oratorical skills to bear against what he perceived as fundamental challenge to Christian truth. The Cistercian abbot's involvement in anti-Cathar activities began in 1145 when Pope Eugenius III commissioned him to preach against heretical movements throughout southern France, recognizing that Bernard's reputation for sanctity and intellectual rigor made him uniquely qualified to counter the prefect's moral authority and theological arguments. Bernard's mission to Languedoc revealed extent to which Cathar influence had penetrated the region's social and political structures. Upon arriving in Toulouse, the Cistercian abbot discovered that Cathar prefect moved freely throughout the city, conducting religious ceremonies in private homes and maintaining workshops serving as informal centers of religious instruction. Local nobility provided open protection for Cathar activities, while significant portions of merchant and artisan classes had embraced dualist teachings or at least viewed them with sympathy. The theological debates Bernard conducted with Cathar prefect demonstrated sophistication of dualist movement and challenges Orthodox Christianity faced in countering its arguments. The prefect who engaged with Bernard possessed extensive knowledge of Scripture and could present coherent explanations for apparent contradictions in Catholic doctrine, particularly regarding existence of evil in world created by omnipotent and benevolent God. Their ascetic lifestyle and reputation for moral integrity provided them with credibility that traditional Catholic clergy often lacked. But Bernard's preaching efforts achieved limited success, and Catholic authorities were beginning to realize that peaceful persuasion wasn't going to work. The Third Lateran Council of 1179 marked crucial escalation in Catholic Church's response to Catharism, as Pope Alexander III and assembled bishops formally condemned dualist beliefs as heretical and established canonical penalties for those who embraced or supported such teachings. The Council's deliberations reflected growing concern among church leadership about Catharism's spread and recognition that previous efforts to combat the movement through preaching and education had proven insufficient. The Council's condemnation encompassed both theological and practical aspects of the movement, identifying specific doctrines contradicting Catholic teaching and behaviors violating canonical law. The bishops condemned the dualist assertion that two divine principles govern universe, declaring this position incompatible with Christian monotheism and doctrine of divine omnipotence. The Council specifically rejected Cathar claims that material world was created by evil deity, affirming instead Catholic teaching that all creation proceeded from single true God and was therefore fundamentally good. The canonical penalties established by Third Lateran Council created legal frameworks for systematic persecution of Cathar communities throughout Catholic Europe. The Council authorized secular authorities to confiscate property of convicted heretics and declared that those who provided support or protection to known Cathars shared in their guilt and deserved similar punishment. These provisions aimed to undermine economic foundations of Cathar communities and eliminate noble protection that had enabled movement to flourish in southern France. The Council's decrees established procedures for identifying, prosecuting, and punishing heretics while providing incentives for those who assisted in these efforts. The Council declared that those who took up arms against heretics would receive same spiritual benefits as Crusaders fighting in Holy Land, effectively transforming anti-heretical warfare into form of religious pilgrimage. The implementation of Third Lateran Council's anti-heretical provisions faced significant obstacles in regions where Catharism enjoyed strong popular support and noble protection. Local secular authorities in Languedoc generally refused to enforce canonical penalties against Cathar communities, viewing such actions as violations of their territorial sovereignty and threats to their economic interests. the integration of Cathar perfect and credentes into social and economic structures of southern French cities made systematic persecution practically difficult and politically dangerous. The diplomatic missions following Third Lateran Council represented attempts to achieve, through negotiation, what canonical penalties had failed to accomplish through coercion. Pope Innocent III, who ascended to papal throne in 1198, initially favoured diplomatic approaches to Cathar problem, believing that skilled negotiators could persuade both heretical communities and their noble protectors to abandon dualist beliefs and return to Catholic orthodoxy. The papal legates dispatched to southern France possessed extensive theological education and diplomatic experience, qualifying them to engage in sophisticated negotiations with both Cathar perfect and nobility who protected them. These legates carried papal authority to offer various incentives for conversion, including promises of amnesty for past heretical activities, guarantees of protection from persecution, and opportunities for former heretics to assume positions within Catholic religious institutions. But the debates that followed would reveal that some theological differences simply couldn't be resolved through compromise. The debates at Carcassonne in 1204 exemplified both possibilities and limitations of diplomatic approaches to resolving Cathar crisis. The papal legates who participated in these discussions found themselves facing Cathar perfect, who possessed thorough knowledge of Scripture and sophisticated theological arguments supporting dualist positions. The perfect demonstrated their ability to engage in complex biblical exegesis and presented coherent explanations for apparent contradictions in Catholic doctrine that had long troubled thoughtful believers. The Carcassonne debates revealed fundamental theological differences that could not be resolved through diplomatic compromise or mutual accommodation. The Cathar perfect maintained their absolute dualist position that two divine principles govern universe, while papal legates insisted on Catholic monotheism and goodness of all creation. Neither side proved willing to modify their essential theological positions despite extensive discussions exploring various aspects of Christian doctrine and practice. The debates at Pamiers in 1207 represented final attempt to achieve diplomatic resolution of Cathar crisis before resorting to military action. The papal legates who participated in these discussions brought enhanced authority from Pope Innocent III and greater flexibility in terms they could offer to encourage Cathar conversion. The discussions included representatives from major Cathar communities throughout Languedoc, as well as secular authorities who had provided protection for heretical activities. The Pamiers debates addressed both theological and political aspects of Cathar problem, as papal legates recognized that resolving religious crisis required addressing secular factors that had enabled dualist communities to flourish. The legates offered various political concessions to noble protectors of Catharism, including recognition of their territorial rights and promises of papal support in conflicts with other authorities. The Cathar perfect who participated maintained their theological positions while demonstrating their continued integration into social and economic structures of southern French society. They argued that their communities provided genuine benefits to secular authorities and that persecution would damage economic and social foundations of regions where they operated. Pierre de Castelnau emerged as most prominent and controversial papal legate involved in anti-Cathar diplomatic efforts during final years before military intervention. A Cistercian monk with extensive theological training and diplomatic experience, Pierre brought both intellectual rigor and uncompromising determination to his mission of eliminating heretical influences from Languedoc. His appointment reflected papal recognition that previous diplomatic efforts had been too accommodating and that more forceful approaches were necessary to achieve meaningful results. Pierre de Castelnau's methods differed significantly from those of earlier papal legates, as he combined diplomatic negotiation with explicit threats of canonical penalties and secular punishment for those who continued supporting Cathar communities. The legate made clear that papal patience with heretical activities had reached its limits, and that continued protection of Cathar perfect would result in severe consequences for both religious and secular authorities. The legate's confrontations with Raymond VI of Toulouse exemplified increasingly hostile relationship between papal authorities and secular protectors of Catharism. Pierre de Castelnau demanded that Count cease his protection of Cathar communities, expel perfect from his territories, and actively support Catholic efforts to eliminate heretical influences from Languedoc. Raymond VI's refusal to comply with these demands led to escalating tensions, culminating in Count's excommunication and placement of his territories under papal interdict. Then came the event that would change everything. On January 15, 1208, near Saint-Gilles, Pierre de Castelnau was returning from unsuccessful negotiations with Raymond VI when he was struck down by armed men, assassinated with spears as he prepared to cross the Rhône River. The circumstances surrounding the legate's death remain historically controversial, with contemporary sources providing conflicting accounts of perpetrators' identities and motivations. Some sources suggest attackers were agents of Raymond VI seeking to eliminate troublesome papal representative who'd threatened Count's political independence and religious policies. Other accounts attribute assassination to local supporters of Catharism who viewed Legate as threat to their communities and religious practices, but regardless of who actually killed him, the political consequences were immediate and decisive. Pope Innocent III had the martyrdom he needed to justify what he'd been planning all along: military action against Cathar communities and their protectors. Within weeks of receiving news of Legate's death, Pope Innocent III issued the Bull Quia Mea on March 10, 1208, formally declaring a crusade against heretical communities of Languedoc and their secular protectors. This papal declaration represented a fundamental shift in Catholic strategy, abandoning decades of attempted persuasion in favor of systematic warfare designed to eliminate Cathar influence through force of arms. The papal bull granted participants in anti-heretical crusade same spiritual benefits traditionally reserved for those fighting to recover Holy Land, including complete remission of sins and protection of property during their absence. These incentives proved particularly attractive to northern French nobility facing economic difficulties, as crusade offered opportunities for territorial acquisition and plunder, while providing spiritual justification for what was essentially war of conquest. The Pope's promise that Crusaders could claim lands of defeated heretics created powerful material motivations, complementing religious enthusiasm. Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, emerged as Crusade's military leader through combination of personal ambition, religious conviction, and political calculation that would define entire character of anti-Cathar campaign. A veteran of Fourth Crusade who had refused to participate in sack of Constantinople due to his strict interpretation of crusading vows, Simon possessed both military experience and moral authority necessary to attract followers to new enterprise. His reputation for personal piety and military competence made him ideal candidate to lead what Pope presented as holy war against heretical corruption. Simon's acceptance of crusading leadership reflected his understanding that Albigensian Crusade offered unprecedented opportunities for territorial expansion and political advancement unavailable through conventional feudal channels. The Earl of Leicester's modest English holdings provided insufficient resources to support his ambitions, while his exclusion from royal favour limited his prospects for advancement within Angevin domains. The papal promise that successful crusaders could claim lands of defeated heretics presented Simon with possibilities for creating independent principality in southern France. The military preparations proceeded with remarkable efficiency throughout spring and summer of 1209, as Simon de Montfort assembled formidable army combining experienced crusading veterans with ambitious younger nobles seeking their first taste of warfare. The crusading army that gathered at Lyon in June 1209 numbered approximately 20,000 men. This force represented one of the largest military concentrations assembled for internal European warfare during medieval period. The Crusaders were coming, and southern France was about to burn. The siege of Béziers began on July 21st, 1209, when crusading army arrived before walls of this prosperous commercial city that had become one of most important centres of Cathar activity in Languedoc. The city's defenders included both Catholic and Cathar inhabitants, as urban population had refused papal demands to expel their heretical neighbours and surrender known perfect to ecclesiastical authorities. This solidarity between Orthodox and heretical citizens reflected complex social relationships that had developed in regions where Catharism had gained substantial influence. The Crusaders initially offered terms that would have spared city if its inhabitants surrendered approximately 200 Cathars known to be residing within its walls. The papal legate Arnaud Amalric, abbot of Citeaux, conducted negotiations with city representatives who maintained they could not distinguish between heretical and Orthodox citizens and would not abandon their neighbours to persecution. This refusal to cooperate with crusading demands reflected both practical considerations and moral principles transcending religious differences within urban community. The assault on Béziers commenced when a group of crusading infantry, described in contemporary sources as ribauds or mercenary foot soldiers, launched unauthorized attack on city's outer defenses on July 22, 1209. These lightly armed troops succeeded in breaching walls through combination of luck and determination, creating openings that enabled main crusading force to enter city before its defenders could organize effective resistance. The rapid collapse of Béziers' defenses caught both attackers and defenders by surprise, transforming what had been expected to be lengthy siege into sudden urban assault. What followed became one of most notorious episodes in medieval warfare. Crusading forces killed virtually entire population without attempting to distinguish between Catholics and Cathars. Contemporary chroniclers reported that between 15,000 and 20,000 inhabitants died during sack, including women, children, and clergy who had sought sanctuary in cities' churches. The infamous phrase attributed to Arnaud Amalric, "Kill them all, God will know his own," when asked how Crusaders should distinguish between heretics and Orthodox believers, encapsulated theological justification that papal authorities provided for indiscriminate violence against populations suspected of harboring Cathars. While historical authenticity of this specific quotation remains debated among scholars, it accurately reflected crusading leadership's position that entire communities bore collective responsibility for tolerating heretical activities and deserved punishment regardless of individual religious affiliations. The destruction of Béziers served multiple strategic purposes beyond elimination of its Cathar population. The massacre demonstrated to other cities throughout Languedoc consequences of resistance to crusading demands, creating psychological pressure that would facilitate subsequent military operations. The complete destruction of one of region's most prosperous commercial centres also eliminated major source of economic support for Cathar communities while providing Crusaders with substantial plunder to finance continued military operations. Contemporary accounts describe systematic looting that followed massacre as crusading forces stripped city of all valuable goods before setting fires that consumed most of its buildings. The destruction was so complete that Béziers never fully recovered its pre-Crusade prosperity, remaining diminished provincial town rather than thriving commercial centre it had been before 1209. The psychological impact of Béziers' destruction extended throughout Languedoc as news of massacre spread rapidly. Many smaller towns and castles surrendered immediately upon Crusaders' approach. preferring submission to risk of suffering similar devastation. This campaign of terror proved highly effective in short term, but it also created hatred that would fuel resistance for decades to come. The siege of Carcassonne began in August 1209 as crusading army moved against this heavily fortified city, controlling crucial transportation routes between Mediterranean coast and interior regions of Languedoc. Unlike Béziers, Carcassonne possessed formidable defensive capabilities, including multiple rings of walls, well-supplied towers, and adequate provisions to withstand extended siege warfare. The city's defenders, commanded by Raymond Roger Tronquevel, Viscount of Béziers and Carcassonne, prepared for prolonged resistance that would test Crusaders' commitment and military capabilities. Crusading forces that invested Carcassonne employed sophisticated siege techniques reflecting commanders' experience in Holy Land warfare and their access to advanced military engineering capabilities. Simon de Montfort's engineers constructed siege towers, catapults, and other mechanical devices designed to breach or overcome cities' defensive walls. The Crusaders also implemented comprehensive blockade, preventing supplies from reaching besieged population while maintaining their own logistical lines through control of surrounding territories. Raymond Roger Tronquevel's decision to negotiate with crusading commanders reflected his recognition that Carcassonne could not withstand indefinite siege without external assistance unlikely to materialize. The young Viscount's attempts to secure honorable terms for his city's surrender demonstrated both his concern for his subjects' welfare and his understanding that continued resistance would likely result in same devastation that had befallen Béziers. The negotiations that followed revealed complex political calculations influencing military decisions throughout Albigensian Crusade. The surrender of Carcassonne on August 15, 1209, provided Simon de Montfort with his first major territorial acquisition and established foundation for his subsequent dominance over much of Languedoc. The terms of surrender granted city's population safe passage to leave with their personal belongings while transferring control of fortress and its territories to crusading leadership. Raymond Roger Tronquevel's death in crusading custody, shortly after surrender, eliminated most prominent secular opponent of crusade in region and cleared way for Simon's assumption of viscounty. The transformation of Simon de Montfort from crusading commander to territorial lord marked crucial evolution in character of Albigensian Crusade as military operations increasingly served Earl of Leicester's personal ambitions rather than purely religious objectives. Simon's assumption of Tronquevel lands provided him with resources and strategic position necessary to conduct independent military operations while maintaining fiction that his activities served papal interests. The siege of Minerve in 1210 demonstrated Simon de Montfort's systematic approach to eliminating Cathar strongholds throughout territories under his control. This small but strategically located fortress had become refuge for perfect fleeing from other conquered territories, making its capture essential for completing suppression of organized Cathar resistance in region. Minerve's defensive position on rocky outcrops surrounded by deep ravines made direct assault extremely difficult, forcing Simon's engineers to employ innovative siege techniques, including construction of massive stone-throwing engine. The siege demonstrated Crusaders' access to advanced military technology and their willingness to invest substantial resources in eliminating even minor Cathar strongholds. The surrender of Minerve in July 1210 led to one of Crusade's most significant mass executions, as approximately 140 perfect, who had taken refuge in fortress, refused offers of conversion to Orthodox Christianity and chose death rather than abandoning their religious beliefs. These Cathars were burned alive in mass execution that contemporary sources describe with mixture of horror and admiration for their steadfast commitment to their faith. The Perfects' willingness to die for their beliefs provided powerful testimony to depth of their religious conviction. The mass burning at Minerve established precedent for systematic execution of Perfect throughout territories under crusading control. The Battle of Muret on September 12, 1213, represented Crusade's most decisive military engagement and fundamentally altered political balance of power throughout southern France and Crown of Aragon's sphere of influence. The battle occurred when Peter II of Aragon, responding to appeals from his vassals in Languedoc, concerned about crusading encroachment on his territorial interests, assembled large army to challenge Simon de Montfort's expanding dominance over region. Peter II's decision to intervene militarily against Crusade reflected complex political calculations extending far beyond religious considerations. The Aragonese king's vassals in Languedoc, including Raymond VI of Toulouse and other lords who had been dispossessed by crusading conquests, had appealed for protection against what they portrayed as papal aggression disguised as religious warfare. Peter's own territorial ambitions in southern France, combined with his concerns about crusading threats to political independence of his vassals, motivated his decision to challenge Simon de Montfort directly. The Aragonese army that assembled at Muret included not only Peter II's own forces but also contingents provided by dispossessed lords of Languedoc and volunteers from throughout Crown of Aragon who viewed conflict as struggle for regional independence against northern French imperialism. This coalition force numbered approximately 4,000 cavalry and substantial infantry support, representing one of the largest armies assembled to oppose Albigensian Crusade. Simon de Montfort's forces at Muret were significantly outnumbered, with approximately 1,700 cavalry and limited infantry support available for engagement. However, Crusading army possessed superior organization, equipment, and tactical experience that would prove decisive in battle's outcome. The battle commenced when Peter II's forces attempted to capture fortress of Muret through direct assault, seeking to eliminate Simon's strategic base in region and demonstrate Aragonese military superiority. The decisive moment occurred when Simon de Montfort personally led cavalry charge that broke through Aragonese lines and created confusion among Peter II's forces. Contemporary accounts describe Earl of Leicester's tactical brilliance in identifying weaknesses in enemy formation and exploiting them through precisely timed attacks that maximized impact of his limited forces. Peter II's death during battle's climactic phase eliminated most powerful secular opponent of Albigensian Crusade and fundamentally altered political situation throughout southern France and Crown of Aragon. The Aragonese king fell while fighting in front ranks of his army, struck down by crusading knights who may not have immediately recognized their royal opponent. Peter's death transformed what had been significant military setback into complete political catastrophe for anti-crusading coalition. The immediate aftermath of Muret saw complete collapse of organized resistance to Simon de Montfort's authority throughout most of Languedoc, as death of Peter II eliminated most credible source of military support for dispossessed lords and Cathar communities. The battle's outcome demonstrated that even most powerful secular authorities could not successfully challenge crusading movement once it had gained momentum and papal support. The psychological impact of victory extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. The political ramifications of Peter II's death proved permanent and decisive, as battle effectively ended centuries of Aragonese political involvement north of Pyrenees. Future Aragonese monarchs would focus their expansionist energies on Mediterranean conquests rather than continental European territories. Simon de Montfort seemed invincible, but his triumph wouldn't last forever. The Fourth Lateran Council of November 1215 formally ratified territorial conquests that Simon de Montfort had achieved through military force, transferring legal title of Toulouse domains to Earl of Leicester and his heirs, while simultaneously establishing canonical frameworks for permanent suppression of Cathar communities throughout Languedoc. Pope Innocent III's endorsement of Simon's acquisitions transformed what had begun as religious crusade into a comprehensive program of political reorganization that would fundamentally alter feudal structure of southern France. The papal decision reflected recognition that military success required institutional consolidation to prevent resurgence of both heretical beliefs and secular authorities who had previously protected them. The council's deliberations regarding Toulouse succession revealed complex legal and political considerations shaping papal policy toward conquered territories. Raymond VI of Toulouse, despite his formal submission to crusading authority and public renunciation of his previous support for Cathar communities, remained under suspicion due to his long history of protecting heretical activities. The disinheritance of Raymond VII, young son of Raymond VI, created dispossessed claimant whose legitimate grievances would fuel decades of subsequent conflict throughout Languedoc. The future count possessed both legal rights to his father's domains and personal motivations for challenging crusading authority that made him natural leader for resistance movements. Simon de Montfort's transformation from crusading commander to territorial prince required fundamental adaptations in his administrative and military strategies, as responsibilities of governing conquered territories differed significantly from objectives of religious warfare. The Earl of Leicester faced challenge of establishing effective control over populations that remained largely hostile to his authority, while maintaining sufficient military strength to defend against external threats and internal rebellions. The administrative system Simon implemented combined northern French feudal practices with adaptations to local conditions and specific requirements of governing recently conquered territories. The resistance that emerged following Fourth Lateran Council's ratification of Simon's conquests initially manifested through scattered local uprisings and guerrilla activities exploiting occupying forces' unfamiliarity with regional geography and their dependence on fortified positions for security. These early resistance movements lacked coordination and central leadership, but they demonstrated depth of popular opposition to crusading rule and persistence of loyalties to traditional authorities. The return of Raymond VII to Languedoc in 1216 transformed fragmented local resistance into coordinated movement with legitimate political objectives and organizational capability to challenge crusading authority directly. The young count's arrival provided dispossessed nobles and displaced populations with focal point for their opposition, while offering hope that traditional political arrangements might be restored through military action. Raymond VII's personal charisma and political legitimacy enabled him to unite diverse resistance groups under common leadership for first time since Crusade's initial phase. The successful capture of Beaucaire after siege lasting several weeks provided Raymond VII with his first significant territorial base and demonstrated that crusading fortifications could be overcome through determined assaults supported by local populations. Then came the turning point. On June 25, 1218, at siege of Toulouse, Simon de Montfort, the invincible crusader, the terror of Languedoc, was struck by stone projectile fired from defensive engine operated by city's defenders. Contemporary accounts describe projectile as having been launched by mangonel operated by women and children, adding symbolic significance to death of Crusade's most successful military commander. Simon de Montfort, the man who had conquered half of southern France, was dead. And everything was about to change. The immediate aftermath of Simon's death saw rapid collapse of centralized crusading authority throughout much of Languedoc, as his son Amalric de Montfort lacked both military experience and political authority necessary to maintain control over territories his father had conquered through personal leadership and military prowess. The younger Montfort's attempt to continue his father's policies faced immediate challenges from resistance forces who recognized that crusading movement had lost its most capable commander and could be defeated through coordinated military action. Raymond VII's exploitation of power vacuum created by Simon's death demonstrated his strategic understanding and organizational capabilities. The Count rapidly expanded his territorial control while crusading forces struggled to adapt to new leadership and coordinate their defensive efforts. The systematic campaign Raymond conducted throughout 1218 and 1219 recovered most of major cities and fortresses his family had lost during Crusade's initial phase, restoring traditional political arrangements and eliminating colonial administrative system Simon had established. The recapture of Toulouse in September 1217, before Simon's death, had already demonstrated depth of popular support for Raymond VII's restoration efforts and weakness of crusading control in areas where they lacked overwhelming military superiority. The city's population had risen spontaneously to support Count's forces, providing crucial intelligence about crusading defensive preparations and actively participating in assault operations against fortified positions held by Simon's garrison. This popular uprising revealed that crusading rule had never achieved genuine acceptance among urban populations, forming backbone of regional economic and political life. But the crusade wasn't over. The French crown was about to intervene. And when King Louis XVIII led royal army into Languedoc in 1226, he brought resources that dwarfed anything previous crusaders had commanded. The intervention of Louis XVIII in 1226 represented fundamental escalation in conflict scale and character, as French crown's direct involvement transformed what had been primarily regional struggle between competing feudal claimants into confrontation between royal authority and provincial independence. The king's decision to lead royal army into Languedoc reflected both his personal commitment to supporting Catholic Church's anti-heretical objectives and his recognition that successful intervention could provide opportunities for expanding royal influence over territories that had traditionally remained outside direct royal control. Louis XVIII's military preparations for 1226 campaign demonstrated superior resources that royal authority could deploy compared to private armies that had conducted previous phases of conflict. The king assembled forces including contingents from throughout royal domain, professional soldiers maintained through royal revenues, and siege equipment manufactured in royal workshops that surpassed anything previously employed in Languedoc. This royal army possessed both numerical strength and technical capabilities necessary to conduct systematic siege warfare against most formidable defensive positions in region. The strategic objectives guiding Louis VIII's campaign extended beyond immediate suppression of resistance movements to encompass broader goals of integrating Languedoc into French royal domain and establishing permanent royal administrative control over region. The siege of Avignon beginning in June 1226 demonstrated both capabilities of royal military forces and determination of urban communities to resist incorporation into French royal domain. The city's strategic position controlling Rhone River navigation and its substantial commercial wealth made it crucial objective for royal forces seeking to establish permanent control over communications between northern France and Mediterranean territories. The prolonged siege continued for 3 months before cities surrender in September 1226. The death of Louis VIII at Montpensier on November 8, 1226, while returning from his successful Languedoc campaign, created succession crisis that temporarily reduced royal pressure on remaining resistance forces and provided Raymond VII with opportunities to recover some of his lost territories. The king's death occurred from dysentery contracted during campaign, common fate for medieval military commanders operating in unfamiliar climates and conditions. The timing of Louis VIII's death prevented him from consolidating his military victories through establishment of permanent administrative structures. The regency government established for young Louis IX faced immediate challenges in maintaining royal control over recently conquered territories while managing competing demands from other regions of kingdom. Queen Blanche of Castile, who assumed responsibility for governing during her son's minority, lacked military resources and political authority necessary to continue aggressive policies Louis VIII had pursued in Languedoc. The Treaty of Paris negotiations that began in 1228 reflected mutual recognition among all parties that continued military conflict could not achieve decisive resolution of fundamental political and religious issues that had generated decades of warfare throughout Languedoc. Raymond VII's partial military successes had demonstrated his continuing ability to challenge royal authority, while Regency government's defensive victories had shown that royal control over conquered territories could be maintained despite persistent resistance efforts. Both sides faced resource constraints, making indefinite continuation of warfare increasingly difficult to sustain. The complex diplomatic process that produced Treaty of Paris involved not only primary military antagonists but also papal representatives concerned with ensuring that any political settlement would serve Catholic Church's anti-heretical objectives. The papal legates who participated in negotiations insisted that any agreement must include provisions for permanent suppression of Cathar communities and establishment of institutional mechanisms to prevent resurgence of heretical activities. The final terms of Treaty of Paris, concluded on April 12, 1229, represented comprehensive political settlement that balanced competing interests of all major parties while establishing frameworks for permanent integration of Languedoc into French royal domain. Raymond VII retained control over reduced territories centered on Toulouse, but accepted royal suzerainty and committed himself to supporting Catholic efforts to eliminate remaining Cathar influences from his domains. The treaty's provisions created institutional mechanisms designed to prevent future conflicts, while ensuring royal supervision of regional political and religious affairs. The territorial provisions transferred substantial portions of traditional Toulouse domains to direct royal control, including strategically important cities and fortresses commanding major transportation routes and commercial centers. These transfers eliminated geographical bases that had enabled previous resistance movements, while providing royal government with resources necessary to maintain permanent military and administrative presence throughout region. But the Treaty of Paris wasn't just about territory. It established legal foundations for something far more systematic, far more terrifying than military conquest. It paved the way for the Inquisition, and the Inquisition would finish what the Crusade had started, not through armies and sieges, but through interrogations, torture, informants, and fire. The perfect could hide from soldiers, but they couldn't hide forever from inquisitors who had all the time in the world, unlimited resources, and sophisticated techniques for breaking down resistance and extracting confessions. The war was ending, but the persecution was just beginning. The Treaty of Paris established legal foundations for systematic persecution, but its implementation required institutional mechanisms capable of identifying, prosecuting, and eliminating Cathar communities that had survived decades of military conflict. Pope Gregory IX recognized that traditional episcopal courts lacked both specialized knowledge and unwavering determination necessary to root out heretical beliefs that had become deeply embedded in social fabric of Languedoc. The papal decision to establish new form of ecclesiastical tribunal, known as the Inquisition, represented revolutionary departure from previous approaches to combating heresy through creation of permanent professional institutions dedicated exclusively to this purpose. The papal bull Excommunicamus, issued on February 20, 1231, formally established legal framework for inquisitorial operations throughout Catholic Europe, granting unprecedented powers to specially appointed judges who would operate independently of local episcopal authority. The selection of Dominican and Franciscan friars to serve as inquisitors reflected papal recognition that effective anti-heretical operations required individuals who possessed both theological sophistication and personal commitment to religious orthodoxy, transcending local loyalties or material interests. The mendicant order's emphasis on poverty, learning, and preaching provided ideal qualifications for judges who would need to distinguish between subtle theological errors and orthodox beliefs while maintaining moral authority among populations that had grown skeptical of clerical corruption. Friars' mobility and independence from local ecclesiastical hierarchies enabled them to operate across territorial boundaries and resist political pressures that might compromise their investigations. The Dominican order's intellectual traditions and organizational capabilities made its members particularly well-suited for inquisitorial service, as their theological training enabled them to engage with sophisticated arguments that Cathar Perfect employed to defend their beliefs. The appointment of Conrad of Marburg as inquisitor for Germany in 1231 demonstrated both potential effectiveness and inherent dangers of new institutional approach to combating heresy. Conrad's previous experience as spiritual advisor to Saint Elizabeth of Hungary had established his reputation for personal sanctity and uncompromising commitment to religious orthodoxy, qualities Gregory IX considered essential for successful inquisitorial service. However, Conrad's appointment also revealed risks associated with granting extensive powers to individuals whose zeal might exceed their judgment. Conrad's inquisitorial activities in Rhineland employed methods that would establish precedents for subsequent operations throughout Europe, including systematic use of informants, application of torture to extract confessions, and coordination of ecclesiastical investigations with secular enforcement mechanisms. And the German inquisitor developed standardized procedures for conducting interrogations combining theological questioning with psychological pressure designed to break down suspects' resistance and extract admissions of guilt. The network of informants Conrad established transformed communities into environments of mutual suspicion, where traditional social relationships became contaminated by fear of denunciation. Conrad's confrontation with secular authorities in Germany revealed tensions between inquisitorial independence and established political structures. The inquisitors' attempts to prosecute suspected heretics among nobility and clergy encountered resistance from individuals who possessed sufficient political influence to challenge his authority directly. Conrad's assassination in 1233 by knights who objected to his investigations demonstrated both effectiveness of his methods and violent opposition that inquisitorial activities could generate. But the assassins had made a mistake. Conrad's death didn't end the Inquisition, it proved that it was necessary. And his successors would be even more systematic, even more thorough. The machinery of persecution was being perfected, and it would grind on for decades. The appointment of Robert le Bougre as inquisitor for northern France following Conrad's death reflected papal determination to continue systematic persecution, despite risks such operations entailed. Robert's background as former Cathar Perfect, who had converted to Catholicism and joined Dominican order, provided him with intimate knowledge of heretical beliefs and practices that proved invaluable in identifying hidden Cathars. The French Inquisitors' operations employed refined techniques, balancing need for thorough investigations with recognition of political realities constraining his activities. Robert's collaboration with royal officials and local bishops created institutional frameworks serving as models for subsequent inquisitorial operations throughout Europe. The procedures Robert developed for conducting interrogations reflected both theological sophistication and practical experience in distinguishing between genuine heretical beliefs and confused or mistaken statements that frightened suspects might make under pressure. The compilation of inquisitorial registers during Robert's tenure established documentary practices becoming standard throughout institutional system, creating permanent records of investigations, confessions and sentences that could serve multiple administrative and legal purposes. These registers provided evidence for property confiscations, enabled coordination between different inquisitorial tribunals, and created precedents for future cases involving similar circumstances. The systematic documentation of inquisitorial proceedings transformed anti-heretical activities from ad hoc responses to specific problems into comprehensive institutional programs designed to eliminate heretical influences permanently. The development of Bernard Gui as most systematic and influential inquisitor of medieval period demonstrated institutional maturation of anti-heretical operations and their evolution from experimental procedures into sophisticated judicial systems. Bernard's appointment as inquisitor for Toulouse in 1307 placed him at center of efforts to eliminate remaining Cathar communities that had survived previous persecution, while his extensive writings on inquisitorial procedures provided theoretical foundations for entire institutional system. Bernard Gui's Practica Inquisitionis, Heretitia Pravitatis, represented most comprehensive manual of inquisitorial procedures produced during medieval period, providing detailed guidance for identifying heretical beliefs, conducting interrogations, evaluating evidence, and imposing appropriate sentences. The manual's systematic approach to anti-heretical operations reflected Bernard's extensive practical experience and his understanding of theological, legal, and political considerations influencing inquisitorial success. The interrogation techniques Bernard developed emphasized psychological manipulation and theological sophistication rather than physical coercion, reflecting his understanding that reliable confessions required genuine conviction rather than mere submission to pain. The inquisitor's questioning strategies involved complex theological discussions designed to reveal suspects' true beliefs, while creating opportunities for them to incriminate themselves through unguarded statements. Bernard's systematic approach to evaluating evidence established standards for inquisitorial proceedings, balancing need for thorough investigations with recognition that false accusations could undermine entire systems' credibility. The network of informants Bernard cultivated provided comprehensive information about suspected heretical activities while creating surveillance systems making clandestine religious practices extremely dangerous. The coordination between Bernard's tribunal and secular authorities demonstrated institutional maturation, characterizing later medieval anti-heretical operations. But even as inquisitors perfected their techniques in cities and towns, one fortress remained, high in Pyrenees, seemingly impregnable. Montségur, the final stronghold of organized Catharism. And in 1243, royal forces decided it was time to eliminate this last bastion of heresy. What followed would become legend. The siege of Montségur, beginning in May 1243, represented culmination of systematic efforts to eliminate final stronghold of organized Cathar resistance in Languedoc. The fortress's strategic position on rocky peak in Pyrenean foothills had enabled it to serve as refuge for perfect fleeing from other conquered territories and as center for coordinating survival of Cathar communities throughout region. The decision to invest Montségur with substantial royal army demonstrated both importance authorities placed on eliminating this last bastion of heretical activity and their recognition that its capture would require significant military resources and sustained effort. The fortress of Montségur occupied virtually impregnable position that had been strengthened over decades to withstand siege warfare, with walls constructed to follow natural contours of mountain peak and defensive positions commanding all approaches to summit. The castle's defenders included approximately 100 perfect who had taken refuge there, along with their Credante supporters and garrison of experienced soldiers commanded by Pierre Roger de Mirepoix. The royal forces that invested Montségur in 1243 numbered approximately 6,000 men under command of Hugues des Arcis, Seneschal of Carcassonne, representing one of the largest military concentrations deployed against single Cathar stronghold during an entire period of systematic persecution. The besieging army included professional soldiers maintained through royal revenues, feudal levies from throughout Languedoc, and specialized siege engineers capable of operating complex mechanical devices necessary for conducting effective siege warfare against heavily fortified positions. The siege operations at Montségur employed most advanced military engineering techniques available in 13th century Europe, including construction of massive stone-throwing engines positioned to bombard fortress from multiple directions and systematic use of mining operations designed to undermine defensive walls. The Royal Engineers faced extraordinary challenges in transporting heavy siege equipment up steep mountain slopes and positioning it effectively against targets located far above their positions. The prolonged nature of siege, which continued for nearly 10 months before fortresses' surrender in March 1244, revealed both effectiveness of defenders' resistance and limitations of medieval siege warfare when conducted against positions possessing both strong fortifications and adequate supplies. The defenders' ability to maintain their resistance throughout harsh winter months of 1243-1244 demonstrated their commitment to their religious beliefs and their understanding that surrender would likely result in execution. The final assault on Montségur occurred after Royal Engineers succeeded in capturing advanced position, enabling them to bring siege engines within effective range of fortresses' main walls. The breakthrough came when a small force of royal soldiers scaled steep cliffs under cover of darkness and overwhelmed outpost defenders had considered impregnable due to apparent impossibility of approaching it directly. The surrender negotiations that followed capture of advanced position revealed both defenders' recognition that their situation had become hopeless and their determination to achieve best possible terms for non-combatant Perfect, who had taken refuge in fortress. Pierre Roger de Mirepoix negotiated 15-day truce that allowed Perfect to prepare for their fate while providing garrison with honorable terms for surrender. The negotiations demonstrated mutual respect that had developed between opposing commanders despite religious and political differences that had motivated their conflict. Then came March 16th, 1244, the day that would become legend, the day 244, Perfect walked calmly to their deaths rather than deny their faith. The mass execution of 244 Perfect on March 16, 1244, represented largest single killing of Cathar religious leaders during entire period of systematic persecution and effectively eliminated organized Cathar resistance throughout Languedoc. The Perfect who chose death rather than conversion to Orthodox Christianity included men and women who had dedicated their lives to preserving and transmitting dualist beliefs despite decades of persecution and military pressure. Their willingness to die for their religious convictions provided powerful testimony to depth of their faith while demonstrating futility of expecting widespread conversion through coercion. The pyre constructed at base of Montségur consumed not only lives of Perfect, but also extensive library of theological texts and religious manuscripts they had preserved throughout years of persecution. The destruction of these documents eliminated crucial sources of Cathar doctrine and practice while preventing future generations from accessing intellectual traditions that had sustained movement for over 2 centuries. The aftermath of Montségur's fall saw systematic elimination of remaining Cathar strongholds throughout Languedoc as royal forces methodically reduced scattered fortresses and safe houses that had enabled Perfect to maintain clandestine religious activities. The comprehensive nature of these operations demonstrated both thoroughness of royal planning and effectiveness of intelligence networks that had identified virtually every location where Cathar religious practices continued. The elimination of these final refugees marked end of organized Cathar resistance and beginning of movement's transformation from visible religious community into completely underground survival network. The psychological impact of Montségur's destruction extended throughout remaining Cathar communities as news of mass execution eliminated hope that organized resistance could successfully challenge combined forces of royal authority and inquisitorial persecution. The destruction of Montségur and execution of 244 Perfect transformed surviving remnants of Catharism from visible religious movement with established institutions into completely clandestine network operating through family connections, commercial relationships, and carefully maintained personal loyalties. The Perfect, who had escaped final siege by fleeing beforehand, along with Credentes who continued supporting them despite overwhelming dangers, faced challenge of preserving their religious traditions without organizational structures, safe houses, and territorial bases that had sustained their movement for over 2 centuries. This transition required fundamental adaptations in how Cathar beliefs were transmitted, religious ceremonies conducted, and communities maintained in an environment where discovery meant certain death. The scattered Perfect, who survived Montségur's fall, possessed extensive knowledge of Cathar doctrine and ritual practices, but they lacked coordinated leadership and institutional frameworks that had previously enabled them to maintain consistency in religious teachings and ceremonial procedures across different regions. Individual Perfect operated in isolation or small groups, relying on personal networks of trusted Credentes for shelter, food, and protection from inquisitorial investigations. These relationships required extraordinary levels of mutual trust and commitment, as betrayal by any single individual could result in capture and execution of entire underground networks. The maintenance of religious practices under these clandestine conditions required significant modifications to traditional Cathar ceremonies and observances. The consolamentum, which had previously been conducted in relative security with multiple Perfect present and substantial numbers of Credentes in attendance, now occurred in hidden locations with minimal participants and abbreviated rituals designed to reduce risks of detection. But even in hiding, even scattered and hunted, the Cathars persisted. And in Catalonia, one last Perfect would keep the faith alive for 2 more decades. The most significant of refugee communities developed in Catalonia under leadership of Guillem Belibast, who emerged as last known Cathar Perfectus to maintain active religious ministry during final decades of movement's existence. Belibast's background as member of prominent Cathar family from Corbière region provided him with extensive theological training and connections to surviving underground networks throughout Languedoc. His decision to establish himself in Catalonia reflected both practical necessity of escaping intensified persecution in his native region and his recognition that movement survival required development of new territorial bases beyond reach of French royal authority. Guillem Belibast's ministry in Catalonia demonstrated remarkable adaptability to changed circumstances confronting surviving Cathar communities in early 14th century, operating primarily in villages of Morella and Saint-Mathieu. Belibast established cover identities as itinerant craftsman and agricultural labourer, while secretly providing religious instruction and conducting ceremonies for small community of Cathar refugees who had followed him into exile. The religious community Belibast established in Catalonia included approximately 20 individuals representing last organized group of practicing Cathars in Western Europe. These refugees maintained their traditional beliefs and practices while adapting to their new environment and security requirements imposed by their clandestine status. The community's small size enabled Belibast to provide personal religious instruction to all members while maintaining close relationships necessary for ensuring their loyalty and discretion in matters that could threaten their collective survival. Belibasta's theological knowledge encompassed full range of traditional Cathar doctrine, including complex dualist cosmology, understanding of reincarnation and spiritual liberation, and ritual procedures necessary for conducting consolamentum and other religious ceremonies. His ability to preserve and transmit these theological traditions without access to written materials or consultation with other perfect demonstrated both his personal capabilities and effectiveness of oral transmission methods that had sustained Cathar communities throughout their period of persecution. The practical challenges confronting Belibasta's ministry included need to maintain economic support for his community while avoiding activities that might attract official attention or create opportunities for betrayal by hostile neighbors. The Perfect and his followers engaged in various forms of agricultural and craft work, providing subsistence-level income while enabling them to maintain their religious practices during periods when they were not occupied with secular labor. The security measures Belibast implemented to protect his community reflected lessons learned from decades of inquisitorial persecution and specific dangers associated with operating in foreign territory, where local knowledge and political connections were limited. The Perfect established procedures for conducting religious meetings that minimized risks of detection while enabling all community members to participate in collective worship and receive religious instruction. The isolation of Belibast's community from other surviving Cathar groups created theological and practical problems, becoming increasingly severe as time passed, without contact with other Perfect or access to broader intellectual traditions that had sustained movement throughout its history. The Perfect's inability to consult with colleagues or verify his interpretations of complex doctrinal questions led to gradual modifications in traditional teachings reflecting his personal understanding and specific needs of his small community. But Belibasta's isolation would prove to be more than just a theological problem. It would make him vulnerable. And French inquisitors knew exactly how to exploit that vulnerability. They sent a spy, someone Belibast would never suspect. Someone from a Cathar family whose father had been executed as heretic. Someone Belibast would trust completely. His name was Arnaud Sicre, and his betrayal would end Catharism forever. The infiltration of Belibast's community by Arnaud Sicre represented culmination of systematic efforts by French inquisitors to eliminate final remnants of organized Catharism through use of sophisticated intelligence operations, exploiting movements' internal vulnerabilities and desperation of individuals seeking to escape persecution. Sicre's background as son of executed Cathar Perfect provided him with knowledge and credibility necessary to gain acceptance within underground religious networks while concealing his transformation into agent of inquisitorial authorities. His recruitment by inquisitors demonstrated their understanding that conventional investigative methods could not penetrate security measures protecting most carefully concealed Cathar communities. Arnaud Sicre's infiltration strategy involved presenting himself as refugee seeking religious guidance and community support, while gradually gathering intelligence about locations, activities, and identities of community members. His knowledge of Cathar doctrine and practices acquired through his family background enabled him to participate convincingly in religious discussions and ceremonies, while identifying information that would be valuable to inquisitors seeking to capture surviving Perfect. The intelligence Sicre gathered during his infiltration included detailed information about Perfect's daily routines, locations where religious meetings occurred, identities and backgrounds of all community members, and communication networks connecting Catalan refuge with surviving Cathar sympathizers in other regions. This comprehensive intelligence enabled inquisitors to plan capture operations that would eliminate not only Belibast himself, but also a broader network of individuals who had supported his ministry and maintained connections to other underground religious activities. The betrayal that led to Belibasta's capture occurred when Sicre convinced Perfect to accompany him on journey to Languedoc under pretense of conducting religious ceremonies for dying credentes who had requested consolamentum. This deception exploited Belibasta's sense of religious duty and his commitment to providing spiritual services to believers regardless of personal risks involved. The arrest of Guillaume Belibast took place in Thierville in 1321, when French officials acting on intelligence provided by Sicre apprehended Perfect as he attempted to cross border into Languedoc. The circumstances of his capture revealed extensive coordination between French inquisitors and local authorities in Catalonia that had been necessary to track his movements and position agents at locations where he might be intercepted. The successful operation demonstrated effectiveness of intelligence-based approaches to eliminating underground religious networks and futility of attempts to maintain clandestine activities indefinitely without detection. Trial of Guillaume Belibast. Before inquisitorial tribunal at Carcassonne followed established procedures for prosecuting suspected heretics while incorporating specific elements designed to extract information about surviving Cathar networks and to create public examples that would discourage others from maintaining heretical beliefs. The inquisitors who conducted proceedings possessed extensive knowledge of Cathar doctrine and could engage in sophisticated theological discussions revealing depth of Belibasta's religious convictions while identifying information that might lead to discovery of other underground religious activities. The interrogation techniques employed during Belibasta's trial reflected accumulated experience of inquisitors who had conducted hundreds of similar proceedings over previous century. The questioning focused on specific aspects of Cathar theology and practice that could provide evidence of heretical beliefs while exploring Perfect's knowledge of other individuals who might be continuing underground religious activities. Then came August 24, 1321. Guillaume Belibast, last known Cathar Perfectus, was burned at stake in Villarouge, Termenès. With his death, organized Catharism as religious movement with active leadership and institutional continuity effectively ended, over 3 centuries of dualist tradition wiped out. But the story doesn't end with Belibasta's death, because what happened next would shape Languedoc's future for centuries. The execution of Guillaume Belibast in 1321 marked not merely death of last known Cathar Perfectus, but beginning of profound transformation that would reshape cultural, linguistic, and political landscape of Languedoc for centuries to come. The systematic elimination of Cathar communities had created vacuum that French royal administration and Catholic ecclesiastical authorities moved swiftly to fill, implementing comprehensive policies designed to erase cultural foundations that had enabled dualist beliefs to flourish while integrating region permanently into broader framework of French civilization. The linguistic transformation of Languedoc represented one of most visible and enduring consequences of Crusade success, as French administrators systematically displaced Occitan as language of government, education, and formal religious instruction. The troubadour courts that had previously sustained Occitan literary traditions found themselves without noble patronage that had enabled their cultural activities, while Perfect, who had contributed to vernacular religious literature, had been eliminated through systematic persecution. French became mandatory language for all official proceedings, legal documents, and educational instruction, relegating Occitan to informal domestic use and rural communities where administrative control remained less comprehensive. The cultural implications of this linguistic shift extended far beyond mere administrative convenience, as language served as primary vehicle for transmitting distinctive intellectual traditions, social customs, and religious sensibilities that had characterized Occitan civilization. The suppression of Occitan literary production eliminated cultural mechanisms through which regional identity had been preserved and transmitted across generations, while imposition of French cultural norms gradually eroded social practices and intellectual frameworks that had distinguished southern France from northern regions of kingdom. The political transformation of Languedoc involved systematic replacement of traditional feudal relationships with direct royal administration that eliminated local autonomy and noble independence that had previously characterized regions' governance. The extensive property confiscations that had accompanied inquisitorial prosecutions transferred vast estates from indigenous noble families to northern French administrators and royal appointees who owed their positions entirely to royal favor. This comprehensive redistribution of landed wealth created new political hierarchies based on loyalty to French crown rather than traditional regional relationships and customary law. The establishment of royal sénéchaussées throughout former territories of Counts of Toulouse created permanent administrative structures that could monitor local political activities and prevent emergence of regional resistance movements. These administrative units possessed both civil and military authority, enabling royal officials to respond quickly to any signs of political dissent while maintaining surveillance networks necessary for detecting underground religious activities. The economic transformation reflected both direct consequences of military destruction and property confiscations, and broader effects of integrating regional commercial networks into French royal economy. The textile industries that had provided economic foundations for many Cathar communities faced disruption through elimination of their skilled craftsmen and destruction of established trade relationships. Northern French merchants and artisans received preferential treatment in allocation of commercial privileges and urban properties, gradually displacing indigenous economic elites and redirecting regional trade toward markets in northern France rather than Mediterranean commercial centers. But perhaps most lasting legacy wasn't what was destroyed, it was what was created. The procedures, techniques, and institutions developed for hunting Cathars would be refined, exported, and used against other heretics for centuries to come. The development of inquisitorial procedures during campaign against Catharism created institutional precedents and legal frameworks that would profoundly influence European religious and judicial institutions for centuries to come. The Dominican and Franciscan inquisitors who had refined their investigative techniques through decades of anti-Cathar operations possessed extensive experience in conducting complex theological interrogations, managing documentary evidence, and coordinating ecclesiastical proceedings with secular enforcement mechanisms. These skills and institutional knowledge were subsequently applied to combating other forms of religious dissent throughout Catholic Europe. And the procedural innovations that inquisitors had developed for identifying and prosecuting Cathars became standardized practices that were codified in legal manuals and transmitted to tribunals operating in different regions and confronting various types of heretical activities. The sophisticated interrogation techniques that had proven effective against Cathar perfect were adapted for use against suspected witches, Jewish converts to Christianity, and members of other religious minorities who faced ecclesiastical investigation. The documentary practices that had enabled inquisitors to maintain comprehensive records of their proceedings created bureaucratic systems that enhanced efficiency and coordination of anti-heretical operations throughout Europe. The legal precedents established through inquisitorial prosecutions of Cathars influenced development of canonical law regarding heresy, property confiscation, and relationship between ecclesiastical and secular judicial authority. The procedures for evaluating evidence, assessing witness testimony, and determining appropriate sentences that had been refined through decades of anti-Cathar operations provided frameworks for subsequent ecclesiastical courts confronting different types of religious deviance. The institutional legacy of medieval Inquisition extended beyond its immediate religious objectives to encompass broader developments in European legal and administrative systems. The bureaucratic procedures, documentary practices, and investigative techniques that had been developed for combating Catharism provided models for secular courts and administrative agencies seeking to enhance their effectiveness in managing complex legal proceedings and maintaining social control. The systematic approach to gathering intelligence, evaluating evidence, and coordinating enforcement activities that had characterized inquisitorial operations influenced development of early modern state institutions throughout Europe. But beyond institutional legacies, Cathar's story would be remembered and reimagined. In 19th century, as Romanticism swept Europe and nationalism challenged old empires, Cathars would be rediscovered. Not as medieval heretics, but as proto-Protestant martyrs, as defenders of Occitan culture against French imperialism, as symbols of religious freedom and resistance to tyranny. Napoleon Peyrat's Histoire des Albigeois, published 1870-1872, transformed historical Cathars into romanticized heroes whose tragic destruction anticipated later struggles for liberty. Writers, poets, and artists drew upon Cathar themes to explore contemporary concerns about religious authority, political freedom, and cultural identity. Montségur became a powerful symbol of heroic resistance, while Perfect were transformed into idealized figures representing spiritual purity and moral courage. Modern esoteric movements claiming connections to historical Catharism incorporated elements of Cathar symbolism into elaborate spiritual systems, combining medieval themes with contemporary occult beliefs. Occitan cultural revival movements adopted Cathar symbols as expressions of regional distinctiveness and opposition to French cultural hegemony. The medieval crusade was reinterpreted as early example of cultural imperialism and systematic destruction of minority cultures, themes resonating with contemporary movements for linguistic and cultural rights throughout Europe. The historical Cathars had become myth, but what were they really? What did they actually believe? What was life actually like for those Perfect and Credentis? Contemporary historical scholarship on Catharism has been revolutionized through archaeological discoveries, manuscript studies, and interdisciplinary approaches providing unprecedented insights into actual beliefs, practices, and social organization of medieval dualist communities. Archaeological excavations at sites associated with Cathar history, including Montségur, Minerve, and various urban centers throughout Languedoc, have revealed material evidence about daily life, economic activities, and cultural practices, supplementing and sometimes contradicting literary sources from period. The systematic analysis of inquisitorial registers and other documentary sources has enabled historians to reconstruct detailed pictures of Cathar communities, their social composition, their relationships with Orthodox neighbors, and their responses to persecution. These documents, originally created as instruments of persecution, now serve as invaluable sources for understanding lived experience of medieval religious minorities and complex social dynamics characterizing regions where competing religious traditions coexisted. The quantitative analysis of inquisitorial records has revealed patterns of religious affiliation, geographic distribution, and social relationships that were invisible to earlier generations of historians who relied primarily on narrative sources. The study of Cathar theological texts, many discovered and edited only within past century, has provided direct access to intellectual traditions and religious practices of medieval dualist communities. These manuscripts reveal sophisticated theological arguments that Cathar Perfect employed to defend their beliefs, ritual procedures they followed in conducting religious ceremonies, and biblical interpretations supporting their understanding of Christian doctrine. The analysis of these texts has corrected many misconceptions about Cathar beliefs while demonstrating intellectual sophistication and internal consistency of dualist theological systems. The interdisciplinary approaches characterizing contemporary Cathar studies have incorporated insights from anthropology, sociology, and religious studies to develop more nuanced understandings of medieval religious movements and their social contexts. Scholars have examined Catharism within broader frameworks of medieval religious diversity, popular religious movements, and relationship between official and unofficial forms of Christian practice. These approaches have revealed extent to which Cathar communities were integrated into social and economic structures of medieval society rather than existing as isolated sectarian groups. The ongoing debates among historians regarding nature and extent of Cathar influence in medieval Europe reflect both complexity of available evidence and methodological challenges involved in studying religious movements that were systematically persecuted and whose records were largely created by their enemies. Some scholars argue that Catharism represented significant alternative to Orthodox Christianity that attracted substantial popular support and posed genuine challenges to ecclesiastical authority. Others contend that movement's influence has been exaggerated and that most of those prosecuted as Cathars were actually Orthodox Christians who became victims of overzealous inquisitors or political persecution disguised as religious investigation. The question of Cathar survival beyond execution of Guillem Belibast remains contentious among historians, with some arguing that underground communities continued to exist for decades or even centuries after apparent elimination of organized religious leadership. The evidence for such survival consists primarily of scattered references in later inquisitorial documents and folk traditions that may preserve elements of Cathar belief or practice. However, systematic nature of 14th century persecution and absence of credible evidence for continued religious organization suggest that Catharism as coherent religious movement effectively ended with elimination of its final perfect. So what's the verdict? What should we remember about the Cathars? The broader historical significance of Catharism extends beyond its immediate religious and political impact to encompass its role in development of medieval European institutions and cultural traditions. The crusade against Catharism demonstrated effectiveness of combining religious motivation with political objectives while establishing precedents for systematic use of military force to achieve religious conformity. The institutional innovations developed during anti-Cathar campaigns influenced evolution of both ecclesiastical and secular administrative systems throughout Europe. The cultural legacy of Catharism encompasses both its historical impact on medieval civilization and its subsequent transformation into symbol of religious liberty and resistance to oppression. The actual beliefs and practices of medieval Cathar communities remain subjects of scholarly investigation and debate, but their historical significance as representatives of religious diversity and victims of systematic persecution has been firmly established. The study of Catharism continues to provide insights into complex relationships between religious belief, political authority, and cultural identity that characterized medieval European society. The final extinction of organized Catharism marked end of last major dualist movement in Western Europe and triumph of Catholic orthodoxy in establishing religious uniformity throughout territories under papal authority. And the systematic elimination of Cathar communities demonstrated both effectiveness of coordinated religious and political persecution and ultimate vulnerability of minority religious movements lacking sufficient military and political resources to defend themselves against determined opponents. The transformation of Languedoc from region of religious diversity into province of Catholic France represented fundamental shift in European religious and cultural geography that would persist for centuries. The historical legacy of Catharism thus encompasses multiple dimensions: the actual medieval religious movement, with its distinctive theological beliefs and social organization, the institutional developments that emerged from efforts to suppress it, and subsequent cultural mythology that has transformed it into symbol of various modern concerns and aspirations. Understanding this complex legacy requires careful attention to both historical evidence and ways in which that evidence has been interpreted and reinterpreted across different periods and cultural contexts. The Cathars believed the material world was created by Satan. They believed human souls were divine sparks trapped in evil flesh. They believed salvation came through rejecting physical pleasures entirely, no meat, no sex, no worldly attachments. They were vegetarians, pacifists, and ascetics who lived among their neighbors as craftsmen and merchants while secretly practicing a religion that denied everything medieval Christianity stood for. For this, they were hunted, tortured, and burned alive. Their cities were destroyed, their culture suppressed, their language nearly eradicated. The Albigensian Crusade and subsequent Inquisition killed tens of thousands and traumatized an entire region for generations. Was it worth it? Did the Catholic Church successfully defend Christian orthodoxy, or did they destroy a beautiful, peaceful, spiritual tradition because it challenged their authority? History doesn't provide simple answers, but it does provide lessons about what happens when religious certainty meets political power, about how easily neighbors can be turned into enemies, about how violence in the name of God rarely achieves the spiritual objectives it claims to serve. The Cathars are gone, but their story remains as warning, as inspiration, as reminder of how fragile tolerance really is, and how precious. The perfect who chose death at Montségur rather than conversion demonstrated level of conviction that even their enemies found remarkable. Medieval chroniclers describe how these 244 men and women walked calmly to pyre, singing hymns, refusing final opportunities to recant. Some were elderly, having practiced their faith for decades. Others were young, recently initiated into ranks of perfect. Many were from wealthy merchant families who had given up everything for their beliefs. They faced flames knowing their theological texts would burn with them, that their communities would be scattered, that their movement would likely die. Yet not one converted. This wasn't fanaticism born of ignorance. These were educated people who had studied scripture, debated theology, made informed choices about what they believed. They simply could not accept that material world created by loving God could contain so much suffering, evil, and corruption. The dualist answer, two gods, one good, one evil, made more sense to them than orthodox explanations. The credentes who supported perfect despite terrible risks also deserve recognition. These ordinary believers, merchants, craftsmen, farmers, knew that hiding perfect or attending clandestine ceremonies could result in property confiscation, imprisonment, or death. Yet families maintained Cathar traditions across generations, protecting perfect, preserving teachings, passing faith to children despite overwhelming pressure to conform. The women who operated mangonels at Toulouse that killed Simon de Montfort, the citizens of Béziers who refused to surrender their Cathar neighbors, the families who harbored fugitive perfect for decades, these people chose solidarity over safety, conscience over conformity. Their courage is worth remembering, even if we don't share their beliefs. The Inquisitors who hunted Cathars also believed they were doing God's work. Bernard Guy genuinely thought he was saving souls by burning heretics. Conrad of Marburg saw himself as defending Christianity against demonic forces. These weren't monsters, they were believers convinced that error had no rights, that heresy threatened eternal salvation of entire communities. The tragedy is that both sides were absolutely certain they possessed truth, and that certainty justified any means necessary to defend it. This pattern, religious conviction leading to violence, persecution justified by spiritual necessity, neighbors turned against each other by theological disputes, has repeated throughout history. The Cathar story is medieval, but themes remain disturbingly relevant. How do we balance religious freedom with social cohesion? When does tolerance of error become complicity with evil? can pluralistic societies survive when members hold radically incompatible worldviews? These questions don't have easy answers. But Cathar history suggests some principles worth considering: that forced conversion rarely produces genuine belief, that persecution often strengthens movements it seeks to destroy, that cultural diversity enriches rather than threatens civilization, and that violence in religion's name usually serves political rather than spiritual objectives. The Cathars believed physical world was prison created by evil God. Medieval Catholics believed Cathars were demonic heretics threatening Christian civilization. Modern scholars recognize both as sincere believers trying to make sense of suffering and evil in a world that often seems cruel and unjust. Perhaps that's the most important lesson, that humans have always struggled with these questions, that different answers have emerged in different times and places, and that humility about our own certainties might prevent us from repeating history's worst mistakes. The theological debates between Cathars and Catholics are largely forgotten now. Few modern people worry about whether Christ had physical body or whether material world was created by Satan. But struggle between tolerance and conformity, diversity and uniformity, conscience and authority continues. And that's why Cathar story still matters. The economic dimensions of Cathar movement deserve more attention than they typically receive. The perfect concentration in textile trades wasn't accidental. Weaving allowed contemplative work compatible with ascetic lifestyle while providing economic independence from ecclesiastical patronage. Cathar workshops became centers of both commercial activity and religious instruction, creating networks that facilitated movement's geographic expansion. The credantes who supported Perfect often came from prosperous merchant and artisan classes, people whose economic success gave them independence to question religious authority and resources to protect communities from persecution. And this wasn't movement of desperately poor seeking revolutionary change. It was movement of economically secure urban populations seeking more authentic spiritual experiences than corrupt Catholic clergy could provide. The Catholic Church's response to Catharism also had significant economic dimensions. Property confiscations from convicted heretics provided substantial revenues for both church and crown, creating financial incentives for vigorous prosecution even when theological threats might not have warranted such extreme measures. The Albigensian Crusade transferred vast wealth from southern French nobility to northern French lords and royal administrators, fundamentally altering regions' economic structure while eliminating independent power bases that had supported religious diversity. The Inquisition's reliance on property confiscations to fund its operations created perverse incentives encouraging prosecution of wealthy suspects whose estates could support continued anti-heretical activities. This economic dimension doesn't invalidate sincere religious motivations driving both Cathars and their persecutors, but it adds important context for understanding why conflict became so brutal and sustained. Wars fought purely over theology rarely last decades, but wars combining theological disputes with opportunities for territorial acquisition and economic enrichment can grind on indefinitely. The destruction of Occitan culture represents one of Cathar story's most tragic legacies. The language that produced troubadour poetry, the cultural traditions that created one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated civilizations, the political autonomy that allowed religious diversity to flourish, all were systematically dismantled in name of religious orthodoxy. Modern Occitan revival movements have reclaimed Cathar symbols as expressions of regional identity, but language and culture were damaged in ways never fully repaired. This cultural destruction wasn't accidental byproduct of religious persecution. It was deliberate policy designed to eliminate foundations that had enabled heresy to flourish. French royal administrators understood that imposing linguistic uniformity and cultural conformity would make future resistance more difficult, while integrating conquered territories into broader French civilization. The success of this cultural suppression demonstrates how easily distinctive traditions can be erased when political and religious authorities combine forces to enforce conformity. The survival of Occitan language and culture in diminished forms also demonstrates remarkable resilience of regional identities even under sustained pressure. Despite centuries of suppression, Occitan survived as living language in rural areas where administrative control remained limited, preserving cultural traditions and historical memory that would eventually fuel modern revival movements. This persistence suggests that cultural identity, once established, proves remarkably difficult to eliminate entirely, even through systematic persecution. The Cathar influence on European literature extended far beyond immediate Occitan context. As courtly love traditions influenced by dualist theology spread throughout medieval Europe, affecting literary development in French, German, Italian, and English. The troubadour emphasis on spiritual love, transcending physical desire, concept of refined love requiring moral purification, the idealization of unattainable beloved, all these themes resonating with Cathar theological principles, shaped European Romantic literature for centuries. This literary legacy represents one of movement's most enduring cultural contributions, preserved long after theological disputes that generated it were forgotten. The role of women in Cathar movement deserves special attention as it represented remarkable departure from contemporary Christian practice. Catholic Church excluded women from all positions of religious authority and viewed female participation in spiritual matters with suspicion, but Catharism welcomed women as full participants in religious life and recognized their capacity for achieving highest levels of spiritual development. Female perfectae, enjoyed equal status with male counterparts and performed identical religious functions, including administering consolamentum, providing religious instruction, and serving as spiritual advisors to both male and female credentes. This gender equality in religious matters reflected Cathar theological understanding that souls possessed no inherent sexual characteristics and that spiritual advancement depended on individual commitment rather than biological factors. The perfecti often established separate communities or houses where they lived together while pursuing their religious vocations, providing secure environments where women could practice their faith without social pressures and physical dangers that might threaten individual perfecti living alone. Many perfecti came from wealthy merchant families or minor nobility, bringing significant resources and social connections to Cathar movement. These women often used their family wealth to support Cathar activities before receiving consolamentum, then continued influencing secular affairs through their networks of relatives and former associates. The participation of high-status women lent respectability to Catharism and helped protect movement from some forms of persecution. The perfecti played crucial roles in transmitting Cathar beliefs to younger generations as they often served as teachers and spiritual mentors for children in Cathar families. Their religious authority extended to conducting marriage ceremonies for credentes according to Cathar customs, blessing newborns and providing counsel on family matters. This involvement in domestic religious life gave perfecti significant influence over daily spiritual practices of Cathar communities. Female religious authority within Catharism attracted considerable attention from Catholic opponents who viewed elevation of women to positions of spiritual leadership as evidence of movement's heretical nature. Catholic polemicists frequently cited prominence of perfecti as proof that Catharism violated natural order and divine law, arguments reflecting broader medieval assumptions about appropriate gender roles in religious contexts. The dramatic contrast between Cathar acceptance of female spiritual authority and Catholic exclusion of women from priesthood raises interesting questions about relationship between theological innovation and social reform. Did Cathar dualism's emphasis on spirit over matter naturally lead to more egalitarian gender relations? Or did presence of wealthy, educated women in movement's ranks influence its theological development in directions supporting female religious authority? Historical evidence doesn't provide definitive answers, but interaction between theological principles and social realities clearly shaped both Cathar beliefs and practices in ways distinguishing it from Orthodox Christianity. The Cathar attitude towards sexuality also reflected their dualist worldview in complex ways deserving careful analysis. The perfect's complete celibacy wasn't simply moral strictness, it represented logical conclusion of belief that procreation perpetuated imprisonment of divine souls in evil material bodies. Every child born meant another soul trapped in physical existence, another victory for Satan, another obstacle to cosmic restoration of all souls to spiritual realm. This perspective made sexuality not merely temptation to be resisted, but active collaboration with forces of evil. For credentes, however, sexuality and marriage were permitted as practical necessities of life in material world, though they were encouraged to receive consolamentum before death to escape reincarnation cycle. The Cathar rejection of procreation raises fascinating philosophical questions about implications of their worldview if universally adopted. If everyone became perfect and ceased having children, humanity would eventually die out, which from Cathar perspective would be triumph, not tragedy, as it would mean no more souls trapped in material bodies. This radical antinatalism represents one of movement's most distinctive and controversial features, challenging fundamental assumptions about value of physical existence and human life that most religious traditions take for granted. Catholic opponents recognized this implication and frequently condemned Catharism as death cult seeking to destroy humanity. Whether Cathars actually intended universal cessation of procreation or simply believed perfect celibacy provided path for spiritually advanced souls, while ordinary believers continued perpetuating species, remains debated among scholars. The practical sustainability of any religious movement requiring its spiritual elite to practice complete celibacy deserves consideration. Catholic Church faced this challenge with priestly celibacy, often enforced imperfectly despite institutional resources and political power supporting it. Cathar Perfect, operating in smaller communities with less institutional support, likely faced similar challenges in maintaining celibacy standards. Though evidence suggests they generally succeeded better than Catholic clergy, perhaps because their entire theological framework emphasized rejection of materiality rather than treating celibacy as isolated moral requirement. The underground survival of Cathar communities after Monségur's fall demonstrates remarkable dedication of both Perfect and Credentes to preserving their faith despite overwhelming dangers. The Perfect, who continued their ministry in hiding, gave up any possibility of normal life. They lived constantly on move, trusted only small circles of supporters, faced certain execution if discovered. The Credentes who harbored them risked property confiscation, torture, and death for entire families. That both groups maintained their commitment for decades after organized movement's destruction testifies to depth of their convictions and strength of bonds created through shared persecution. The betrayal of Guillaume Belibast by Arnaud Sicre represents a particularly poignant episode illustrating moral complexities of religious conflict. Sicre, son of executed Cathar Perfect, had every reason to hate inquisitors who killed his father, yet he became their agent, infiltrating Belibast's community and befriending Perfect before betraying him. What motivated Sicre? Contemporary sources suggest financial rewards and promises of clemency for his own family, but perhaps also genuine conversion to Catholicism and belief he was serving God by eliminating heresy. Or perhaps simple survival instinct in situation where collaboration with inquisitors offered only path to safety. Whatever his motivations, Seeker's betrayal illustrates how sustained persecution corrodes trust, turns neighbors into informants, and forces impossible choices upon ordinary people caught between competing religious and political authorities. The final trial and execution of Guillaume Belibast, followed by systematic elimination of his community members through subsequent inquisitorial investigations, demonstrates chilling efficiency of institutional persecution when given sufficient time and resources. The Inquisition didn't need dramatic military campaigns or mass executions. It could methodically identify, prosecute, and eliminate underground religious networks through patient intelligence gathering, sophisticated interrogation techniques, and coordination with secular authorities. This bureaucratic approach to religious persecution proved far more effective than crusading armies had been at eliminating Catharism's final remnants. The institutional innovations developed through anti-Cathar operations, documentary systems, interrogation procedures, networks of informants, coordination between ecclesiastical and secular authorities, provided templates for subsequent religious persecution throughout Europe and beyond. The Spanish Inquisition, witch hunts, persecution of Protestant minorities in Catholic territories, oppression of Catholic minorities in Protestant regions all drew upon techniques and institutional frameworks developed during campaign against Cathars. This disturbing legacy reminds us how easily institutional mechanisms created for one purpose can be adapted for others, how bureaucratic systems can make persecution routine and efficient, how documentary procedures can transform individual tragedies into statistical records. The question of whether Catharism represented genuine threat to Catholic Christianity or whether Church overreacted to relatively minor heretical movement remains debated. From Catholic perspective of time, Catharism's rapid growth, noble protection, and sophisticated theology posed serious challenge to ecclesiastical authority and orthodox doctrine. The movement had converted significant portions of Languedoc's population, established parallel religious institutions competing with Catholic Church, and demonstrated remarkable resilience against initial persecution efforts. If left unchecked, Catharism might have continued expanding, potentially establishing permanent alternative Christian tradition in southern Europe. From modern perspective, with benefit of hindsight, Cathar threat appears less existential. Movement remained geographically limited, never developed institutions matching Catholic Church's resources and reach, and probably would have faced increasing difficulties maintaining its two-tiered system as it expanded beyond regions where social conditions favored its particular organizational approach. The perfect's complete asceticism, while admirable and source of movement's moral authority, limited number of people willing to join spiritual elite, while credente's delayed consolamentum created theological tensions about salvific efficacy of deathbed conversions. Whether these internal contradictions would have eventually weakened Catharism, or whether movement would have evolved new solutions to these challenges remains unknowable given its violent suppression. The broader question of religious tolerance and limits of acceptable diversity within Christian tradition emerges from Cathar's story with troubling clarity. Medieval Catholic Church operated within theological framework, viewing heresy as spiritual disease, threatening eternal salvation of entire communities, making its elimination not merely political preference but religious duty. This perspective, combined with political and economic motivations discussed earlier, created conditions making violent persecution seem not only justified but necessary. Modern sensibilities favoring religious pluralism and individual conscience struggle with this medieval worldview. We want to condemn persecution while acknowledging that from within their own framework, Catholic authorities acted with at least some genuine conviction that they were saving souls and defending truth. This doesn't excuse atrocities committed, but it complicates simplistic narratives portraying Crusaders and Inquisitors as purely villainous and Cathars as purely victims. The Cathar legacy in modern France remains contentious and politically charged. For Occitan cultural movements, Cathars represent martyrs to regional identity destroyed by French imperialism, symbols of suppressed culture deserving recognition and restoration. For French nationalists, Albigensian Crusade represents necessary unification, bringing backward, heresy-ridden region into national community and Catholic orthodoxy. For secular liberals, Cathar's story warns against dangers of religious intolerance and celebrates resistance to oppression. For Catholic conservatives, Crusade against Catharism demonstrates Church's historic role in defending Christian civilization against heretical corruption. These competing narratives reflect contemporary political concerns more than historical realities, but they demonstrate how medieval religious conflicts continue shaping modern cultural and political identities. The tourism industry around Cathar sites, particularly Montségur, Carcassonne, and other fortresses associated with movement, has created popular historical consciousness, mixing accurate information with romantic myths and esoteric speculation. Visitors drawn by Dan Brown-style mysteries or New Age spirituality often encounter very different Catharism than one revealed by historical scholarship. This popular fascination ensures Cathar memory persists, but sometimes at cost of historical accuracy. The challenge for historians becomes distinguishing genuine historical evidence from later romantic elaborations, while acknowledging that both historical reality and subsequent mythology tell us important things about human religious experience and cultural memory. The final lesson we might draw from Cathar's story concerns relationship between religious conviction and human dignity. Both Cathars and their persecutors believed absolutely in their respective truths, and that absolute certainty led to tremendous suffering on all sides. The perfect who walked willingly to flames at Montségur, the Crusaders who slaughtered 20,000 at Béziers, the Inquisitors who devoted careers to hunting heretics, the Credantes who harbored perfect despite terrible risks, all acted from conviction that they possessed truth worth dying or killing for. Perhaps the most profound question Cathar's story raises is whether such tragic conflicts are inevitable when people hold incompatible worldviews with religious conviction, or whether some form of coexistence might have been possible if political and economic factors hadn't intensified theological disputes. We'll never know what might have happened if Cathars and Catholics had been left to work out their differences through debate rather than crusade, if Raymond VI had succeeded in maintaining his protection of religious diversity, if Bernard of Clairvaux's preaching missions had been given more time before military intervention. The historical record shows us only what did happen: theological disagreement escalating into political crisis, military conquest destroying religious communities, institutional persecution eliminating final remnants of organized movement. Whether this outcome was inevitable given medieval Christian theology and political realities, or whether alternative paths existed, remains open question, with implications extending far beyond Cathar history to contemporary struggles over religious pluralism and limits of tolerance. The transformation of Languedoc from region of relative religious diversity and cultural sophistication into province of Catholic France, where Occitan language was suppressed and cultural tradition systematically dismantled, represents cultural loss whose full dimensions remain difficult to assess. What literary works might have been created had troubadour tradition continued flourishing? What theological innovations might have emerged from continued dialogue between Cathar and Catholic thinkers? What political arrangements might have developed in southern France if regional autonomy had been preserved? These counterfactual questions can't be answered definitively, but they remind us that crusade against Catharism eliminated not only specific religious movement, but entire world of cultural and intellectual possibilities. The survivors, both physical survivors of crusade and cultural survivors preserving Occitan traditions despite suppression, passed down memories, stories, and resentments shaping southern French identity for generations. These collective memories, however imperfectly preserved and romantically elaborated, kept alive consciousness that things had once been different, that cultural autonomy and religious diversity had once flourished before being destroyed by northern French imperialism and Catholic intolerance. The Cathars are gone. Their churches are ruins, their theological texts mostly destroyed, their language suppressed, their culture transformed beyond recognition. But their story survives, preserved in inquisitorial registers documenting their persecution, in archaeological remains of their fortresses and communities, in folk memories and romantic legends, in modern scholarship reconstructing their beliefs and practices from fragmentary evidence. This survival, imperfect and contested as it is, ensures that questions raised by Cathar experience remain relevant. How do we balance religious freedom with social cohesion? When does theological error become threat requiring suppression? Can pluralistic societies accommodate groups holding radically incompatible worldviews? What are limits of tolerance, and who decides where those limits lie? The Cathars believed material world was created by Satan, that salvation required rejecting physical existence, that spiritual perfection meant complete renunciation of worldly pleasures. Medieval Catholics believed Cathars were demonic heretics whose teachings threatened Christian civilization and eternal salvation of souls they corrupted. Both sides held their convictions with absolute certainty, and that certainty led to one of medieval Europe's most tragic conflicts. Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson, that certainty itself, religious, political, or ideological, poses dangers when combined with power to enforce conformity. The Cathars lost their war, but their story remains as warning, as inspiration, as reminder of both human capacity for transcendent conviction and human tendency toward violent intolerance. The flames at Montségur burned 780 years ago, but the questions they raise still burn today. Subscribe to Flow of History to explore more stories of medieval religious conflicts, from the Hussite Wars to the Spanish Inquisition, from the persecution of the Waldensians to the trials of the Knights Templar, where faith, power, and violence collided to shape European civilization in ways still echoing through our world today.